Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited. Hopefully it'll be a good session and really great that so many of you took the time to come out. Um, just a little bit of background and framing about what we're going to cover today. So this session is actually based on a book Ballerine has written that tracks merchant fraud patterns. So, we're living in quite a new world of new technology and AI. And just as ourselves on the payment provider side and banking and acquiring and PayFac side are all adapting to these and trying to, use these new technologies to stay up to date with merchant fraud patterns. Unfortunately, the fraudsters are also leveraging these. So we're going to dig in today to a few different kind of typologies of merchant risk that we found. And we're going to hopefully be able to walk away from here with some practical things for you guys to implement on your end. There's a link, if it's interesting, to the book here at the bottom of the page. And so without further ado, I think we'll get into it. I'm Robbie. I'm from the risk team here at Ballerine. And what we'll hope you'll walk away with today is we're actually going to dive in to four specific kind of merchant fraud typologies that we've seen. These are taken from the book that we've released. Um, and we're going to dig into some of the signals you can look out for, what to be aware of, how these typologies work, as well as we're going to get a bit of practitioner perspective, which is going to maybe bring it down to a level which will raise some interesting questions and some info about maybe best practices about how to put these lessons into practice, as well as looking forward, not at an individual merchant level only, but also at building out a merchant risk framework at the program level. So without further ado, I've introduced myself, and we'll take a minute to introduce the practitioners who are going to be joining us as well. So Evan is here, and Joe will be joining us in just a moment. So Evan, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are today. Evan Canavan, Vice President of Risk Management for SMB Merchant Acquiring at Priority. Been in the industry since 2018, and previous, I was doing tax investigations for the New Jersey State Treasury with a high concentration in tax fraud. And something that I always think is funny and bringing up my past experience is that in that role, we used to perform asset seizure with the New Jersey State Police. So we would show up with law enforcement, locksmith, and perform asset seizure for non-payment of taxes. And when we used to execute those situations, I think most people saw it coming, and therefore we didn't get a lot of negative reaction. Surprisingly, when I joined the payments industry in 2018, I learned firsthand that holding a merchant's funds for even nominal amounts would garner much more aggressive responses. So we take our decision to hold funds very seriously, and we make sure that we're always doing the right thing there. So thank you, Robert.
Yeah, of course. And we're joined by Joe, who is a VP of Payments Risk at Avidia Bank. So, Joe, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Sorry about that. I had some technical difficulties there, but I'm able to join. So my name is Joe Palombo. I'm the VP of Payments Risk here at Avidia Bank. I got started in a kind of a security and compliance field when I worked for a domain name brokerage and parking program right after college. So we were in charge of kind of making sure revenue wasn't inflated intentionally, domain names weren't getting hijacked, and then when they got sold, they ended up in the right people's hands, and the right people got paid. So that was kind of interesting. And from there, I moved on to the ISO world, where I worked for Cayenne/Merchant Warehouse, and basically handled the e-commerce portfolio, especially the new internet accounts. Took a break in the middle of there to kind of dip my toe in the startup world when COVID hit, and then ended up back in payments with Avidia Bank 5 years later. So here I am, and I'm still learning something new every day.
Very cool. So thank you guys. We're really happy to have you here, and thank you for joining. Your expertise, I'm sure, will be well appreciated by everyone. And in general, I think these webinars are super important because I've always felt that if on the risk and compliance side, if we collaborated and shared as much knowledge as the fraudsters do, I'm not sure if anyone's here has ever been in a black hat forum or dark web forum. If we could collaborate as much as the other side, we would do well to share that knowledge. So just a bit of framing of the problem and what we're going to cover today. So fraud is becoming a new kind of issue now, in that it's really a network problem. With the advent of AI and with new technologies, the, let's say, barrier to entry to produce convincing fraudulent merchant applications, including, today we're mostly going to touch on the website and business model aspect, but in terms of also KYB data and other things, the barrier to entry has just become so much lower. So this problem that once maybe was at a smaller scale or had a higher barrier of entry has just exploded, where bad actors now have new tools at their disposal that present a really interesting challenge for our end of things. And as well as that, there's changes to merchant behavior, and stopping these things at the point of onboarding, as well as in ongoing monitoring, is ever more important, because sometimes things pop up only after the fact. Because one thing we'll focus on is that oftentimes these things occur at a network level, and that anytime there's a single merchant, it should be a trigger to understand that perhaps that's not the whole story. So we're going to touch on various different aspects, but first we'll take a look at kind of the different typologies of merchants we're going to cover today. One is called the logistics cluster. So this has to do with third-party logistics providers, maybe subtle signals you can understand that you're actually dealing with a large network of malicious merchants rather than any kind of individual pinpointed problem. Second case we're going to look at has to do specifically with deceptive negative option billing merchants. So these present a risk, especially in terms of chargebacks, as well as card scheme compliance, because the card schemes have very particular rules when it comes to negative option merchants. Third case has to do with software platforms that actually may present at a surface level as offering just software, but many of them, their business models actually include payment services or downstream risk of who is using those products, that you may actually be liable for how it's being used because payments are involved. And then lastly, we're going to tackle cases of merchants who are onboarding in order to do transaction laundering. And they may present a very low risk kind of posture, but in reality, what's happening in the background is something completely different that is going to be very, very important to pay attention to. So without further ado, we'll get into the first case, okay? And in each of the cases, we're going to look at what the scenario is, some of the signals you can pick up behind these typologies, what it actually means practically, and maybe if there's a lesson to take away. So before we get into the first one, we're actually going to put up a poll. You should actually all be able to see it and to be able to answer. And this is going to create a bit of discussion. Of course, we're going to have Q&A at the end, so it might be interesting to see how others are doing things as well, where you guys can please answer, and we're going to understand how most of us are doing things today. So, yeah, I see everyone is filling in, and the percentage is updating accordingly. Very cool. So it looks like most of us are using, sounds about right, a mix of manual review and automated tools. And I think it'll be very interesting when Evan and Joe speak in the second portion of the webinar after I take us through these 4 cases about what that kind of mix of manual review and automated solutions looks like. So second question here that will help set the stage for these different cases is about whether you're actually looking at things in a networked way in a cross-portfolio analysis, looking at shared infrastructure between merchants, or whether it's mostly on an individual level, or perhaps just ad hoc based on the specific case. And I think for all of the don't know answers, maybe this webinar will be a good place to come back with something internally where you guys can clarify and open a discussion on some of the best practices for these issues. And then the last question in the poll is, how often do you update detection rules or risk thresholds? And this is becoming more relevant than ever because it seems as though the adoption of merchant fraud typologies is changing at a pace that we've never really seen before. And therefore, having some kind of continuous fine tuning of this becomes ever more important. Cool. Amazing. So I think thank you guys for sharing a bit about how you're doing things today. So without further ado, we'll jump in to the first kind of typology, which is, as we mentioned, something called the logistics cluster. So what does this mean? So oftentimes, especially as I see many of you are doing network analysis, oftentimes you'll come across networks where there's supposedly dozens of independent merchants that are under perhaps different LLCs and even sell different kinds of products, but in reality, they're actually part of the same operator cluster. And what do we mean when we're talking about a logistics cluster? So this usually has to do with e-commerce merchants, usually in unrelated product categories, and with a kind of, they'll sell low risk consumer goods, clothing, gadgets, and oftentimes they present as very low risk. But if you look a bit deeper, you actually can see that they're usually sharing certain kinds of infrastructure. Maybe not at the, corporate entity level or even in other signals, but oftentimes you'll see that they're actually sharing logistics hubs or that the return addresses can be traced back to specific locations, oftentimes in particular jurisdictions, either in the US or across China. And this is a way to actually see that there's dozens of entities that are supposedly separate that are actually operating together. And just before we go too deep into it, I want to remind everyone that you can ask questions in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A section, we'll be able to address them. So oftentimes, these kind of logistics hubs actually, maintain the standard database of, it might be good to keep a database of things like return addresses, if they're using a registered agent or the same registered agent, or different operational addresses that actually might come from different sources, like, their website. So the first thing, what does a logistics cluster usually sell? Like we said, something innocuous, like online art supplies. Usually it's going to be something pretty low risk. So it's not necessarily going to hit a flag for the content itself. But when you actually dig into it, you can see that they use things like the same warehouse address or same third-party logistics provider, along with other common data points that are actually going to be able to expand the network and understand that this is part of more than a single operator. And oftentimes with these third-party logistics hubs, there's a very high chargeback risk because they're not holding the inventory. Sometimes they're not actually sending the products, or they have very, very poor kind of fulfillment and return policy practices. And these present quite a tangible chargeback risk, which is going to be something that may present real credit risk exposure, or as Evan mentioned, anytime there's funds involved, it's going to be quite sensitive to how you handle these cases. So that's one thing always to be aware of. And it goes beyond just looking at what the merchant is doing or what they're selling into how they're operating and some of these subtle signals in the background. So the next case we'll take a minute to look at is pretty interesting. It's a negative option trap. So this could be across various different kind of products being sold. Sometimes it's a subscription to a fitness app. Sometimes it's actually a consumer good that you would think you're only buying once, but in the background, you've actually, as a consumer, given your consent in lots of legalese kind of hidden at the bottom, or in what's called digital dark patterns, where something is actually not very clear in the user experience to the consumer, where they might think they're purchasing something in a one-off purchase, but actually recurring charges are going to show up. And what's the problem with this is oftentimes, if you're only catching it through the surge in chargebacks, it might be too late. You've already been exposed. So the question is, maybe is there a way to catch these things at the point of onboarding, or if it's changed in ongoing monitoring, to catch these at the first possible point to reduce that exposure across time. And just a practical kind of takeaway in terms of analyzing these kind of merchants, when you do pick up on a flag, is you're going to want to understand what the real checkout flow is and what actually happens when a consumer goes through that process. So it's going to have to do with picking up on recurring billing language as a trigger, or if it actually is a negative option merchant you'd like to work with, you're going to need to classify that under the correct type of MCC, as that will be what should dictate the MCC rather than necessarily just what's being sold. So what might that look like? So I mentioned different business models. So for example, this was an online travel concierge. They offer travel services. They might lure people in looking to get services for a particular trip that's coming up. But what they're not really realizing is in the background that there actually is a recurring subscription. And this might be something buried deep, deep in the terms and conditions that's not really disclosed. Sometimes it's actually going to be revealed through complaints of unauthorized charges or people not understanding why they were charged recurringly. And that might actually happen off the website. So it's important to also be aware of consumer sentiment, looking at places like Trustpilot or other complaint forums, looking for complaints about the particular billing descriptor. And this is something just on a funny personal note. This week, my father was looking through his credit card statement and suddenly found, hey, I don't recognize this charge. I didn't buy anything from a merchant in Cyprus. And I immediately went, please send that to me. I think I know what's going on. And sure enough, something popped up to him in an ad online, a kind of fitness, hey, get a free trial. You can do these fun at-home fitness exercises. And sure enough, after a month, what was free or maybe $1 suddenly showed up as an $80 charge from a merchant in Cyprus. And that's going to end in a chargeback or a dispute. So picking up and understanding these business models can save a lot of pain later because these are intentionally deceptive merchants who are not trying to disclose these things. And most consumers, unless they're very savvy, are not going to pick up on them. So that's a particular case that I think is good to be aware of. And I would say one thing to be particularly mindful of is digital goods are particularly apt for this. So fitness apps, travel concierge. It does happen with physical goods as well, but digital goods are particularly at risk of this. Cool. So the next case that we'll go into a bit actually has to do with hidden aggregation. So as I mentioned, SaaS platforms, someone who says we actually offer a software for merchants in the hotel business or in a particular line of business where maybe they're offering services to that niche vertical. But one of the things about the value prop of these merchants is oftentimes they say, well, we'll actually help you integrate to payments platforms and we'll actually handle the payments through this. You can actually collect payments through us, which really means that when it comes to handling funds, they're part of this flow and it becomes very apt for abuse by bad actors who might want to launder some kind of hidden activity through this. So they might actually say, okay, I'm a hotel, but in reality, that third party that the software platform is serving is actually hiding some illicit or higher risk activity. So it's really about understanding that there's a sub-merchant population for these applications that becomes part of the risk assessment itself and understanding, does this merchant actually have some part of the funds flow involved? So what might that look like? It would look like something, again, this is hotel software services. So in general, might be onboarded and look like an MCC that has to do with, technology because they're a SaaS platform. But in reality, they're actually touting that they can integrate into payment flows and allow you to accept and process online payments, including card transactions, and manage the settlement. And what that means is you're actually looking at a completely different business model than just a pure SaaS platform, where that downstream pool of the customers they serve is actually a third-party risk you're definitely going to want to be aware of. So it's always important to not just look at the surface level of, okay, they have to do with hotel booking management, but if that booking management has to do with payments, you're in an entirely different world of, risk. So I think with that, we'll go to the last typology, which is something we like to call the ghost merchant. And before we get into it, I just want to say that this is something that is exploding. I'd say the fraudsters are having a very good time enjoying a lower barrier of entry. So what does that mean? It means that they're going to try to onboard with a merchant application that almost always looks relatively straightforward, relatively low risk, something that doesn't necessarily set off too many alarm bells at the content detection level. But why are they opening these low risk merchants through merchant applications? Is actually to launder for something high risk or illegal in the background. So that could be illicit online gambling. It could be high risk nutraceuticals or non-prescription pharmaceutical or illicit adult. These are, to put it in card scheme compliance language, we're talking about transaction laundering. And these are the type of merchants who present something as low risk, but are at very high risk to end in a brand violation or a TLD notification from the card schemes, which carry significant both reputational and monetary consequences. So what's actually going to happen in the background is that something that looks like a shoe store or an ebooks catalog or some kind of maybe digital good is in reality processing for one of those high risk or illicit activities. Oftentimes also, these websites will serve a dual process. It's actually something quite interesting that we've noticed as well. It's not every merchant, but some of them will actually, it's quite smart from a fraudster side. They're going to actually lure people in with kind of too good to be true offers. And the website is going to serve a dual purpose. It's both going to launder transactions for something high risk or illegal. And if on the way, the merchant can lure unassuming, cardholders into leaving their credit card details there as well, they're actually going to steal them and then start to process them on other sites and maybe see if they can get away with recurring billing charges and take funds from there until someone maybe notices. And these websites tend to pop up, these applications tend to pop up in large bulk, okay? It's very easy to make. Today, all you need to do is use AI to create kind of templated sites that have a different line of business, slightly change the copy, slightly alter the UI. But in reality, they're all operated by the same operator and all meant to try to serve as load balancing sites for processing illicit transactions. So some of the things that are very important to look for are more of the subtle signals. So maybe the ticket sizes don't make sense according to what's on the website and the prices. Maybe the traffic to the website is almost non-existent, but supposedly it's supposed to be a consumer-facing storefront. People should be accessing this website to make purchases, but if in reality the traffic is coming from somewhere else, you're going to see that anomaly in traffic data. It also could be at the level of maybe they didn't go, maybe the homepage looks great, but if you actually go into some of the products pages, you'll see that it's not really realistic, the kind of detail they give for what should be, something that's targeting consumers. You want to give them real information. You want them to have a pleasant buyer experience. So sometimes it's going to come down to looking a little bit deeper, because on the surface, and I think that's something that is true across all of these cases, on the surface, they're going to look quite okay. But once you start to look at some of the more subtle signals, you're going to see that there's something off. So we're going to actually look at two specific kinds of cases, one in which it's actually possible to trace where the illicit transaction is coming from, in another that actually relies on aggregating all of these subtle signals and saying, this low risk website, something is off about it. So the first case, this is something we see quite often where, okay, a digital good, something that doesn't actually require the holding of inventory or making too complex of a website. So this was a merchant that claimed to offer hosting solutions. Sometimes it's like VPS hosting, sometimes it's web development websites, sometimes it's SEO generation, sometimes it's general business consulting, but it's something that is pretty amorphous and you don't actually need to have a real business in the background. It's pretty easy to say, okay, well, it's just a landing page. People just come here and they see this is the service I offer, it's digital, and yeah, everything happens in the background. But what could we see about this merchant? And this is a real case. What we actually found is they were laundering for IPTV merchant. So IPTV is Internet Protocol TV. It's those too good to be true offers, which can't possibly be given in a compliant manner, where basically you can get hundreds or thousands of channels, all of the movies in the world, all of the sports across all of the different geographies, including oftentimes adult content that will be offered for an unrealistic, very low price, like $35 a month to get all of the content in the world, essentially. Now, the card schemes are pretty strict, and it's definitely on their radar. Some of you, I hope you're not familiar, but you might be, that sometimes there's card scheme notifications that come out of these types of merchants. And what we were able to actually see is that this is the streaming website here on the left, where you're actually buying this package of TV. And on the right, you see that this Zeus host, which was the merchant that was presented to do VPS hosting, they're actually processing the payments in the background for this IPTV. And through the ability to track different technical parameters and look for shared infrastructure, it's actually able to be uncovered. Now, and this is just a bit about how this was actually able to be done, based on shared support phone numbers, based on tracing the actual buyer flow on the violating side, to understand that the billing and client portal actually happens through the front merchant. So that's one example. The second example is the other kind of scenario I mentioned, where maybe you're not going to be able to trace it all the way back to understand that this is for gambling or for IPTV or for illicit pharmaceuticals, but actually by just looking at the declared merchant website and business model, you're going to be able to pick up on all kinds of subtle signals that will tip you off that this is not a real consumer-facing site. So like I mentioned, it could be the traffic, it could be the UI, or it could be the prices. So these are lunch boxes. This is not a sensible price range. Or it could be, this was another example that definitely made me laugh, and it's a bit small, so I'll try to read it for you. So you see here on this plates on the left with the blue pattern. These are 10-inch porcelain dinner plates with, albeit a very, very nice pattern, that cost $149. And literally the product next to it are 10-inch porcelain dinner plates that just happen to be solid white, and they only cost $9.99. So I like a nice pattern, but there's no sensible reason why the same product, besides patterning and color, should have such a price discrepancy between $149 and $9.99. So these are the type of subtle signals that can help you understand this is not a real merchant. These are very, very high risk for transaction laundering. So now that we've gone through some of these different cases, we're going to get into the second part of the webinar, which is going to be over to Joe and Evan to speak a bit more about how you actually implement this as a program. What are some of the things that can help you to catch some of this fraud? And what does it mean in a practical sense when you're actually going to be able to implement these things in your day-to-day? So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over and ask some questions of Joe and Evan that are going to help to kind of break down different aspects of merchant risk analysis. So I think we'll start here with maybe about actually the review perimeter and onboarding and monitoring. So Joe, I'd like to ask you, so I know that sometimes internally, it's often the mindset is onboard first, and then kind of if something pops up, you'll catch it in post onboarding, and that should kind of be the first line of control rather than the main line of control being at the onboarding stage. So might I ask, like, where does that resistance sometimes come from internally, and why does that actually make it a challenge to a successful merchant risk program?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to everybody's in the business to make money, right? So you're processing for merchants, you're boarding merchants. A lot of these organizations, ISOs, PayFacs, whatever it may be, they see the influx of revenue. They see the influx of volume. They're happy with that. Same thing, relative to specifically an ISO or people who directly underwrite merchants. That sales agent is getting residuals from that account. That sales agent is making money. So I think there's a lot of resistance there once the account is established to then be monitored and caught doing something nefarious. That takes away from a company's bottom line. It takes money out of an agent's pocket. You're putting in, I mean, if you want to do persistent monitoring on merchants, you have to build a staff. You need technology. You need to be able to analyze the data and pull the data in. So maybe executive leadership or people that run those departments could be put off by having to invest that money when they're already making money, even though they don't know where it's coming from or how it's being generated. So I think those are some important things to think about. And it also affects the underwriting culture. Underwriters do their job. They tag or flag an merchant at onboarding. That could be a problem, which most likely, if you're experienced, will be a problem. And if you're consistently or just by practice outside of payments risk, developing a strategy or developing acceptance for those merchants, or just simply not caring, that's a problem down the line that is going to catch up with anybody that's not proactively monitoring this stuff. So I think those are the things that you need to think about when you're promoting your department or your company to take up monitoring, because there is going to probably be some pushback. And as long as you're prepared to answer those questions and justify those efforts, hopefully it's a positive outcome.
Yeah, definitely. I think main one of the main challenges is really framing the issue because, of course, like you mentioned, the business side oftentimes sees the immediate opportunity, but the fines and reputational and aggregate damage of exposure to malicious merchants oftentimes isn't at the forefront of mind from their perspective. And having the ability to come and lay these things out clearly, what does the risk look like and why these controls are important is definitely super big aspect in framing the entire discussion.
Yep, agreed.
So yeah, so Evan, I wanted to ask, like, and we have probably participants here from various different kinds of organizations that work at different scales. But even if you're a small merchant portfolio or an incredibly large one that you're managing, there's always the question of how do I do the most with my human resources? And so I wanted to ask, like, what's the line between what a team can actually monitor manually and what needs to be more automated, and what does that threshold look like between those things?
Yeah, it's a critical question. I think, especially given the current climate and the industry that we're in, and the ever marching path towards AI and automation. And it's going to depend on, like you mentioned, scale and complexity. The higher the volume of data at hand that we're ingesting, the more complex analysis that we want to perform generally leads to the increase in automation, right? Generally, we'll see that the automated functions of a risk engine are concentrated at the front, and they're performing sophisticated calculations and funneling results to a manageable population.
Yep.
But the balance is required between automation and human engagement. And risk management, in my opinion, I always like to say, is uniquely scientific, but also an art form. And you can design systems, implement AI, and ensure you are building to scale, which I believe are all critical. But at the end of the day, you'll still need an operator behind the scenes that's analyzing the data output and decisioning the alerts. Risk can, I think, ultimately be a very gray area, right? A system sees two merchants in the same industry that each run a sale for $5,000. But what are the external factors beyond the data, beyond the transactional data, that make one of those sales safe and the other risky? And that's where I think the human lives.
Absolutely. I think that's super important. And I think you hit the framework exactly on the head. I think as it's operating in a risk-based approach, how can we narrow the funnel to segment the population and then put the best, human eyes to deal with the complexities in the gray area? And sometimes that's unique to the business opportunity or to the specific risk appetite of a particular organization. So yeah, very well said, guys. So the next topic we kind of want to cover is, again, this network level. So as we know, there's a lot of shared infrastructure, and the difference between picking up on the scale of malicious merchant activity and how exposed you are can be whether you're dealing with it kind of one by one or in a kind of more sophisticated network way. So like Evan, on that sense, like, do you maybe have some insight or examples of decisions that came out differently because you were able to look at things in a networked level rather than at an individual level? And it could be, I think we all have these stories. Sometimes we have success stories where we're able to pick up on the network and it actually is a huge win. And there's also cases where the opposite happens and you kind of siloed it and there was something missing and you find out later. So yeah, any experience or war stories to share?
Oh, that's the beauty of this industry, right? There's always war stories, and I think Robert, honestly, one of your examples stole some of this thunder here, but it absolutely bears repeating, right? I think it's critical that we never develop tunnel vision, even when we're looking at one customer's account, right? That we don't develop tunnel vision within that specific account itself, because we need to at all times be looking and operating holistically. If we don't, then the chances are we may miss a critical piece of information that can help us mitigate loss on that account or on the portfolio. There are one-off fraud attempts, but we know that with each passing day, the ability to inflict damage grows exponentially due to the increasing accessibility of stolen information via data breaches, dark web, learned patterns or behaviors of risk mitigation systems, which is another excellent point, right? If it's a network and they're probing defenses, and something gets through, or even if something doesn't, that's learning behavior by a network. That's something that we'll kind of touch on in a little bit. And the ever globalization of fraud networks. We can utilize the scientific side of things, risk engines, KYC best practices, a partnership with an industry-leading MMSP like Ballerine, but we still need someone at the controls to review the output and make decisions. I think e-commerce merchants are tricky, right? They're more complex in a lot of different ways. Definitely to validate, given the lack of physical brick and mortar footprint. And we can look towards a digital footprint, such as business history, customer reviews. But if they don't have that, maybe they're a startup, it's a lot more complex. A fraud network in our industry is generally looking to steal, as much money as they can before they're discovered. So what does that mean? That, they're really going to try to disguise their applications, their accounts as legitimate businesses, legitimate owners, legitimate operations. So the first pass at validating the business, finding concerns may be more difficult because they're actively trying to fool defenses and KYC controls. So it results in, unfortunately, the approval of the account. But we have to look at things in a more skeptical, approach. I think focusing on, broadening scope may allow us to find other bad accounts. We have instances where, we've caught networks all at once by dragging, a wide net that looks at similarities, right? Velocity of submissions, the submitting channel, geographical location, the industry type, processing method, the level of digital footprint that exists for those businesses. And then on a more granular level, the website layout. And Robert, you already touched on this, but I can't stress enough how critical and important that is. Seemingly unrelated businesses on the surface level, e-commerce merchants that have similar DBAs, right, or even DBAs that just don't even make sense.
Yeah.
A combination, odd combination of maybe it's the phone number and half of the merchant's website name, similar product offerings, similar website layout, including the same layout, exact same layout, right, of navigational tabs within the website, where pictures are located, even the same pictures at times. And again, these are seemingly supposed to be unrelated businesses, different owners, et cetera. And then Robert, price points, that's an excellent point. Price points that don't make sense for the product that's being offered. And one thing that's helped my team catch bad actors is to put yourself in the shoes of the consumer, right? Removing yourself from the underwriter or the risk analyst, and looking at things from a consumer level. Would we as consumers have ever found this website or even trust this website with our methods of payment? Why are we purchasing whatever is being listed on the website from this merchant as opposed to a trusted business or somewhere else, right? Do things ultimately make sense? And a lot of times with these bad actors, they don't, right?
Yeah, I think that's always a good kind of basic reality check. Does this make sense? So Joe,
Yep.
I just wanted to ask. Oh, I think we lost Joe for a sec. Okay, so either way, we'll move on to the last kind of topic we wanted to cover, which is how can you actually kind of adapt, because we know things are changing and they're very dynamic, and ideally you're always learning from what has happened in order to adjust risk models, in order to also adjust processes and procedures. And so Evan, like, how are you guys doing things in terms of Joe, we got you back, wonderful. So I was just mentioning about how we can adapt our programs in terms of matching how different fraud typologies are changing, and how you actually keep this kind of dynamic game we're playing, that it's reflected in detection, in detection framework. So Joe, um, how do you view building a program that actually can keep up with these different kind of fraud patterns and evolve? And I know we talked about, maybe some challenges in communicating to other stakeholders. Maybe that's a bottleneck. Maybe it's a technical bottleneck. I don't know. Could you share a bit about what it means to adapt, and maybe where these bottlenecks usually sit, and like how you can attack changes at a structural level? Don't, Joe, I'm not sure we can hear you if you're talking. Thank you. Okay, either you're on mute or there's a microphone problem. But maybe Evan, do you want to take the same question about how to kind of deal with adaptation and retuning your processes and procedures in order to keep up with a changing fraud typology?
Yeah, I think ultimately it starts with ingesting and sourcing and analyzing the right data points, right?
There we go.
Staying, Joe, can we hear you?
Yep.
Yay.
Robert, do you want me to continue?
Yeah, maybe finish your thought, and then Joe
Sure.
as well.
Yeah.
For your perspective.
Yeah. So, Joe, in my opinion, just ingesting the right data points, keeping track of them, and ensuring that that the level of criticality is applied to them. Right. Tracking this information helps us stay, hopefully one step ahead of bad actors. So it is, at all times, ingesting correct data points, identifying concerning trends, whether it's fraudulent, and even if it's not, right? Credit-related risks, reputational-related risks, and then making sure that the system you're using, best practices, are being informed by that data.
Yeah, I would totally agree. It's all about being able to ingest the data, tie it to something critical or something important that's going to lead you to make risk-based decisions. It's where that data goes. If it's going to be talking between your two systems, whether it be CRM, your underwriting engine, your transaction monitoring solution, all those things you need to figure out how to that can make them talk to each other, so you can preserve those data points, because you're going to have new accounts coming in every single day, and they could be coming in 100 a day or 10 a day. And if you have that data mining going on, you're really starting to map together the characteristics and the demographics of these different merchants that are getting into the payments ecosystem and disrupting it. The better off you'll be. So you move away from, individual merchant underwriting. You're going to have, if you could, anyone could open a siloed shop that has 25, 30 underwriters, and they're each putting eyes on an application, and they decide to work that way. Well, that's going to make every merchant a one-off decision. And when you're taking in these data points, which you're able to do now, sometimes I know some institutions use a negative file internally. So that information is frontline for that institution, that bank, that ISO, whatever it may be, because the engines are ingesting that data and proactively preventing them from getting into the ecosystem. So I totally agree, Evan.
Yeah, great. Thank you guys. So now we kind of want to loop it back and look at the outcome of the polls we've taken and how everyone is doing things a bit differently. And we see that most are, I think it's exactly the right framework of a mix of manual and automated. So like Evan was saying really clearly, that it's good to basically use automation to help yourself work at scale, but you still need these manual controls. So I think the question is how you can implement that funnel in a more effective way. And then again, it's good to see that most people are aware that yes, these issues happen cross portfolio in a networked way, and having some ability to use that data to retune your kind of risk scoring is very important. And then again, just about updating. And I didn't specifically call it out, but I think it was written in the previous slide, which is quite interesting, is, you know, how often are you actually updating these detection thresholds? Because sometimes the lag is all that's needed for a small, you know, vulnerability to be exploited at scale. So when you pick up on something, the ability to adapt very quickly is quite important. So I think if anyone has any questions, anything that came up generally interesting in the world of merchant risk related to this particular framing of the webinar, something you'd also maybe noticed or like to share, feel free to pop it in the chat. And then we have a few questions here that we'll go through. So we see, do ghost mentions tend to process low volume for a while before scaling, or do they usually activate suddenly once the fraud network is ready? So it's a great question. As with most things in fraud, the tendency is to get away with what you can. So it also might have to do with understanding particular vulnerabilities. So if there's an ability to immediately transact at large volume, maybe they've actually already figured out the answer to that question, and they will immediately start processing at scale. Other times, maybe the way that it's being done is actually through very low volume, which won't hit any kind of transaction monitoring threshold. It won't be very high risk for anything else. But after a few months have passed, suddenly it explodes. So it really depends on, again, how well the fraudster is understanding this kind of dance they're doing with your own controls. But one thing, regardless, that we usually see, whether it happens quickly or after a few months of inactivity, is that it's never one merchant. They're sometimes not trying to hit a dollar threshold on the particular account by load balancing, but the way they do that, because ideally they want to have enough volume that it's worthwhile for them to commit this fraud, is by spreading it out amongst tons of different merchants. So usually mini merchant IDs. So, okay, another question. According to dark web thread, setting up new merchant account costs only a few $100s, and fraudsters who use merchants to monetize compromised cards, the account becomes disposable infrastructure. By the time the chargeback arrives, I don't see what the rest of the question is, but definitely an interesting topic. So, yes, one of the things, like I mentioned about stealing credit card data, this also can be a way to cash out. So I know we're coming up on time, but one thing that's quite interesting, just to think about carding, and I know this wasn't our topic, but it's very interesting. If in the past, to steal credit card data, the way to cash out was to buy kind of high value items and then resell them, okay? Now you actually can directly cash out by making a throwaway merchant account, stealing credit card data, and then just purchasing, you know, your own products on your you know, front website that doesn't sell any real product. So it's become a very streamlined way to steal credit card data and then to cash this out. So I know we're right about time. I want to thank Joe and Evan. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and for joining. And I want to thank all of you guys for joining the webinar. It's super great to see so many people. And we're always, like I started out saying, we like the collaboration and the knowledge sharing. It's very important. And I think we all have a lot to learn from each other. So thank you very much for joining. And if you guys want to learn more about any of these trends or a bit more in detail, you can get a copy of the book that we've released there at the bottom of the screen. So we hope it was interesting and enjoyable. And cheers to everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, everybody. It was a great time.
Yeah, cheers, guys.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.